Major funding for these broadcasts is made possible by grants from New York Community Bank, Capital One Bank, Perfect Building Maintenance, Chase Commercial Term Lending, M&T Bank, Genova Burns. Additional support is provided by AKA Hotels, Corman Communities, Aerial Property Advisors, AVR Realty Company, Bank of America Merrill Lynch, Bank Leumi USA, Briarwood Organization, CBRE, Citizens Bank, Collins Building Services, Connect One Bank, CPEX Real Estate Services, Cushman & Wakefield, DDG, Dime Savings Bank of Williamsburg, Douglaston Development, Levine Builders, Fisher Brothers, First Nationwide Title Agency, Flushing Bank, Friedman, Handler Real Estate Organization, HAP Investments, Investors Bank, James D. Kuhn Real Estate Center at Syracuse University, Kilroy Architectural Windows, New York's Window Company, Madison Realty Capital, Matone Group, Mercantile Commerce Bank, Meridian Capital Group, New Banks, Optimum Window Manufacturing Corp., People's United Bank, Rosewood Realty Group, SJP Properties, Sterling National Bank, Stonehenge Partners, TD Bank, Terra CRG, The Continuum Company, The Moynihan Group, and These Friends.
It was Grandpa Adolf and the bank robbery story. And then, a couple of buildings. Father goes to City College, goes to architect school, lacrosse. Kids born Norfolk, Virginia, the Bronx, Regal Park, Syracuse University. I'm going to be in the construction business. Maybe I'm going to even get involved with the horse racing business. And you know what? I really like football. I'm going to go see the Jets. So I have the legendary contractor, the head of Component Assembly Systems, Chairman and CEO, Lou Rapaport. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Michael. So
let's talk about grandparents. You told me when we got together that your grandfather on your father's side, Adolf, came over at 1895 at 18 years of age alone.
That is correct. He was apprenticed to a plumber when he came, I guess through connections or people they knew. Well, he knew over
there was
here.
No family. He came.
No, not maybe family that knew of. He knew of, but not his family.
Not his family. So he resides where at that time?
Lower Manhattan and Lower East Side.
He gets a license. He becomes one of licensed plumber in the early part of the turn of the century.
He becomes a licensed plumber, starts his own plumbing shop down there, and names his plumbing company after his first daughter, Pauline, and the company was called Pauline Plumbing back in 1912. And
when you and I got together, you were telling me there's a great story about the robbery, and the plumbing business.
Yeah, my dad worked for his father when he was in school, and right next door to them, and I'll leave out the names, was local gangsters, because everybody in the Lower East Side was either a comedian, a businessman, or a gangster.
Or a peddler.
A peddler, right. And a lot of the famous comedians and singers came out of that neighborhood besides the gangsters, and of course my grandfather, a hard-working plumber. Anyway, my father was in the shop, and right next door was this criminal with a gang, and they used to hide their guns under my grandfather's stoop going into the plumbing shop. And one day my father and my grandfather were going up the steps to the local bank, and down the steps were a group of these gangsters with their bandanas half off. And they ran by my father and my grandfather. And a few days later, my grandfather and my father was working in the shop. And in walks one of these fellas. And he looks at my grandfather and he says, Mr. Rapaport, he says, there was a bank robbery. And my grandfather says, there was? I wouldn't know of such a thing. And my father said to my grandfather after the other fellow left, but Dad, we were there. He says, we weren't there. You never saw nothing. Anyway, that's the famous story my father tells.
Now, but Grandpa at that time also, like, he bought a building, you said.
He owned 3 or 4 buildings on the Lower East Side where the old immigrants stayed. And unfortunately, during the Depression, they couldn't collect rents, and he lost a number of them. And my grandmother lived on the last 2 until she was gone.
Now, let's talk about Mom's side. You were talking to me about Tannersville before.
Yes, my mother's mother and father, my mother's mother, her father came over probably 1870 or in that neighborhood and was a peddler in the Catskill Mountains. They lived in Tannersville, and he slowly brought over his whole family, uncles, aunts, so forth. And unfortunately, he sold all of his pots and pans to the farmers during the spring. And one winter, he got frozen to death, and they found him the following spring with his horse and buggy. But he brought over a lot of people, and one of the uncles was Honigsbaum. They had all the stores through that area, the famous Honigsbaum stores. His brother Frank, and anyway, that family spread out through the whole upstate New York and owned a number of stores and so forth.
When did your mother's mother come here?
I would guess they must have come here in the mid-20s, late 20s, in that ballpark.
Now, your father, you said to me, went to City College.
And Columbia School of Architecture.
Right, and for architecture and Columbia. And at City College, we have that picture of him playing lacrosse.
He played lacrosse for City College in 1929-30. I have articles from the New York Times of where he played second defense for the lacrosse team, and he...
So Dad graduated from City College and Columbia?
Yeah, in those days you went 4 years and 4 years. So he went to, today you do it combined architecture
6 or 7 years.
And undergraduate, but in those days he had 2 degrees.
And he then becomes an architect?
Yes.
And where's his office?
His office was 32 Union Square, right next to S. Klein in those days.
On the square, as they would say.
S. Klein on the square. And old man Sam Klein was a client of my father's. My father used to do little renovations in the building where Klein's was for old man Klein. And as a matter of fact, there was one famous story my father told me back then about Sam Klein, who started Klein's. He had his wife get all their lady friends together on a Saturday morning and give them all a few dollars, and they'd be big crowds in front of Klein's on Saturday, and everybody to show that the crowd was there, what they were giving away. And this was his marketing, probably, back in the 30s.
So your father he starts his own architectural?
He had his own architectural firm,
and
always had one draftsman, and was a master builder because he did build a few things on his own, small.
Which we'll get to in a second. You're born 1937.
Right.
And at that time, you're living in the Bronx. The family's living up in the Bronx. And during the war, your father is drafted.
My father was contacted by our government and was assigned to the British Ministry of War and redesigned ships that went back and forth.
So you moved now to Norfolk, Virginia.
Right.
So what were you telling me? He would redesign ships?
A ship would go out carrying foodstuffs or troops to England, and the ship's silhouette would be 3 stacks and 10 guns. When that ship returned, my father would get the carpenters and the crews and redesign the ship in camouflage and show that ship would now have 8 stacks and 22 guns, and it would be all camouflage. And when the German subs would see the ships going back and forth, they would look and say, that's not in our book, because the silhouette showed a different ship and they didn't know. So that's what he did during the war.
So he finishes the war in 1945. They moved back to the Bronx or Regal Park at this
Regal
time?
Park.
They moved to Regal Park. And so where do you go to public school?
PS 139
In
Regal Park, 1 block from my house, on right off Saunders Street and 63rd Drive.
Do you ever think of construction at this time? I mean, your father was was an
No, I
architect.
used to see him come home because he worked 6 days a week with these big, long, they looked like hammers to me, but they were architectural drafting tools. And my brother and I used to use them to fight with each other, but I didn't know much about construction or what he was doing. I went on to junior high in Westchester, and I was very involved in all the sports. I played basketball.
Right, you played basketball. You were a point guard when you...
Played basketball for the Regal Park Jewish Center. Our junior team was one of the best in Queens, if not the best. Our senior team had, unfortunately, a lot of the fellows that got caught up in the scandal played on the senior team. Eddie Gard was one, and several others.
So you graduated from Mamaroneck. This is what,
55.
55. And how did you decide that you wanted to go to Syracuse, to the...
Well, I had an uncle across the street that graduated from Syracuse, and my father spoke to him, and we went to Syracuse. Originally, I thought I was going to go to Gettysburg College, where Bobby Davies, who was a famous basketball player in his day and an all-star in the NBA, was the coach. And my coach reached out for him, and I thought maybe I could get a partial scholarship or play there or as a walk-on. But my dad said, Gettysburg College, you're going to a university. So,
which is interesting because of the fact that you have the involvement with the military museums.
Yeah, I'm very involved with the USS Constitution Museum and
the
the
World War
II Museum in New Orleans.
So how do you get to be a history buff when you were a kid?
I loved history, and when I was in high school, I think I read every book in the library about the Civil War, and I used to take them away in the summer, and I just enjoyed it until I named my older son, whose name is William. His middle name is Lee. William Lee is named after Robert E. Lee, who I thought was a great general and still do.
So you're at Syracuse.
Yes.
And you like point guard and you like Sammy, the fraternity, which we have a picture of you and your wife from a Sammy event, Sigma
Right.
Alpha Mu. So what do you do during the summers up when you're at Syracuse?
I worked in construction. My father had friends of his that were designing and building buildings. I worked in Tuckahoe as a job construction assistant during one summer, and of course my junior year I spent in Fort Bragg, North Carolina, and I was ROTC.
So how do you decide to be ROTC? ROTC was for certain people, okay? It was a military commitment, but it was a smart move at that time.
Well, I enjoyed the military. I enjoyed the history about the military and everything else, and I said, well, something. Why go in as an enlisted man? Because there was a draft and people were. I said, I'd like to be an officer, and I went for it.
So you graduate Syracuse, 1959.
I graduated in 59 in May. I got married in June of 59 and went in the Army in October of 59 to Fort Sill, Oklahoma, to the Artillery and Missile School.
And how long were you there?
Well, about 5 months.
And then?
Then went on to Fort Dix as a training officer, and then went into civilian life.
So when did you come back from the military? In 1960?
I came back in the mid-'60s, yeah.
So at that time you also had the reserve obligation.
Yes, for another number of years, and I went back to Fort Sill during my reserve obligation.
For the 2 weeks.
For the summers, yeah.
Yeah, that was summer camp. Okay.
Summer camp.
Summer
right.
camp, at the Finger Lakes.
It was a little different because we were firing 105s and 155s. It was not
I remember.
camp
I was a very good typist at Fort Sill. You went to Watertown, New York.
No, I was at Fort Sill. Watertown was Camp Drum.
Camp Drum. That was my summer vacations. For 5 weeks.
That was also artillery they had up there.
So you finished the program, and how do you get a job with Webb and Knapp?
I originally, when I finished the program, I went to work in Pleasantville, New York. There was a doctor building a big garden apartment in Pleasantville. My dad had designed it, and through his auspices, we knew who was building it, and they got me a job as an assistant construction supervisor. Almost, a year out of the Army or thereabouts. Worked there for a year, went on to Ossipee, New York, built a big 6-story apartment house for several builders in Westchester. I was the head construction guy. Job was over, I had no job. And the FHA inspector recommended me to Webb and Knapp in New York, the original Zeckendorf, who was building at the time Lincoln Towers.
People hear about the legendary Zeckendorf. Webb and Knapp was a huge company. He was, he had the property at the UN. He had Lincoln
Towers. He was building Kips Bay at the same time. Very, very big builder, very smart guy. Most of his stuff was FHA at the time,
right? Federal
Housing Administration. But he had a big organization, and unfortunately ran into some hard times towards, let's say, 1962-3, and his partners on Lincoln Towers were Alcoa, and Alcoa took over the project.
So did you work on Lincoln Towers?
I was an assistant super on one building. We had, I don't remember, 6 or 8 buildings we built. We had our own batch plant. We poured the concrete on the job, and each one of the assistants was in charge of their own building.
It's 1964. There's something called the World's Fair. And how do you decide to go out on your own? Because it's 1964, you're 27 years of age, and your father was an entrepreneur, but an architect working with his own little operation. How do you get the initiative to start this little business? And I think it was $120. You made a kitchen?
Well, we put
maybe 140.
It was a small check for this pavilion of gas at the World's Fair. United Metal Cabinet, which was the manufacturer, was the cabinet manufacturer at Lincoln Towers, so we knew them. But I had a fellow that I worked with at Lincoln Towers who had the same job as I did. He was a carpenter by trade.
He was the Norwegian guy from Brooklyn.
Right. He was a Norwegian fellow from Brooklyn, very smart, very astute guy. And we went in business together. We each put in $1,000. And he and his father and his brother-in-law were our carpenters in our team. I still stayed at Lincoln Towers for a while and then moved over in '64, and we opened a little office in New Rochelle with 2 rooms. The back room you had to bend your head in to get underneath the beams, and that was our office.
And what was the name of the company?
The name of the company at the time was Score Carpentry.
How did you decide on Score Carpentry?
I don't remember how.
I know how we were going to talk how you create a component assembly system later on, but it was Score Carpentry.
Score Carpentry, and that was our company, and we did several. We couldn't get any work in New York. It was almost impossible because we were not known, and all the big companies were here. So we got our first break. We got a big job in Rhode Island, a big garden apartment, and through auspices of a company called Robert Chuckrow. No longer in business, but Mr. Chuckrow at the time was building all the Kinney shoe stores and Robert Hall stores. And this was his first foray into commercial, residential kind of a thing. And I still remember the name of the company that was Mr. Fain of Fain Carpets was the developer of this Rhode Island.
And you built the interiors for
We did all it was wood framing, so we put all the beams and the trusses, everything had to do with carpentry. There was no drywall at that time. It was just plaster and carpentry. And that was the beginning of what we started this company. And my associate at the time, we were together for 3-4 years, and then he decided he wanted to build houses, and we parted company as good friends.
And you paid for him the price of a Chrysler?
I gave him his Chrysler that we had, and I think maybe $1,000 because we had no money, and the company was a deficit net worth probably about 1968, thereabouts, when this happened.
Now, you told me something interesting in your life was your father-in-law knew a number of people in New York, and he was helpful also to help you with...
Well, my father-in-law originally took me for our first loan. My father-in-law was the accountant and the alter ego of Sam Rudin when the Rudins first started. And this goes back before Jack and Lewis were even in the business. But my father-in-law was the accountant and eventually became the treasurer of Rudin. And so forth. But in the early days, I needed $5,000, and my father-in-law took me to the old Chase Manhattan Bank. I still remember the gentleman's name, the Vice President Gene Conway, and I presented the picture. I wanted to borrow $5,000. My father-in-law sat with me. He knew the gentleman. And after looking over, he says, "Your son-in-law has nothing. They have zero, less, they're minus." He says, "I can't loan them $5,000 because I'd get in trouble with the bank." He says, "But if you want to sign for it," he said to my father-in-law, "I'll give him the money." My father-in-law says, "No, I want him to get it on his own." And a few years later, Franklin National Bank, through again my father-in-law's auspices, loaned me $7,500.
Franklin National Bank, I've done a number of shows, was always helpful to young entrepreneurs and everything.
They were very nice to me. That branch was at the UN Plaza over there, and the gentleman's name was Jack Meiklem. Gentleman, real nice fellow, and had faith in that maybe we would do something.
Today, after the 9/11 difficulties, you made the bridges over the overpasses for...
We did all the safety and bridges at where this 9/11 came down, when the World Trade Center came down. We were the contractor that was assigned to the job by the general contractors who had the contracts to do all the safety, build all the bridges, do everything that had to be done to make sure that the...
So what year was component assembly system created?
I would say sometime in the mid-1970s, or maybe 74, 75.
Right, that's when people were looking at possibilities of going public or other
There were
ideas.
that was a lot of going on, modular housing, so forth. We were doing a lot of garden apartment work, wood framing, on sites around the country for a company from Boston, the Beacon Companies, Leventhal family, and they had projects all over Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, Virginia, and wherever they went to build, we did, and we set up on-site factories where we built the walls and the floors, brought them out to the jobs, put them in place by cranes, and we prefabbed everything on the site in our own little factories. And a friend of mine, who's still a very close friend, said to me, "Maybe you should go public with this, what you're doing all over the place. But you can't use the name Score Carpentry, but you're putting a lot of pieces together.
So you
maybe
put all
you
the
should
components.
Maybe you should be Component Assembly." And my good friend Mike Dritz, who was in Wall Street at the time, and he came up with the name, and that's what we did. And after looking at some underwriters and having very serious meetings, I decided, I'm going to stay private, which I did.
Now, over the years, if you go through New York, you would go around the country. There are hotel rooms. I mean, City University, Mount Sinai, NYU, all over the Reagan Library, Seven World, One World, all of the property, the Calvacharo Transportation Center. I mean, this is what Component's been doing today, like 432 Park, as I said, and a number of other properties over there. But you've had in addition to that, you've had a couple of interesting things that you have done over the years, like the Super Bowl. Tell me the story about that.
Well, I have 4 friends of mine. We're still all together. I have pictures from every Super Bowl except the first 2 in California, where we didn't go as a group. We happened to go separately, and we met 5 fellas, 3 in the real estate business, 1 is a builder from Georgia, my friend Larry McDonald. We started taking pictures together at the Super Bowl in the early 70s.
And you have these jackets?
We had jackets with crests on them. We're on our 3rd set of sport jackets, and we have club jackets with footballs on the back and our names. And
so you've made 49 of them, right?
We've been to 49, not as a group, but separately, but as a group, probably 45. And this year we're all going again in San Francisco. The oldest fellow is 85. 2 of the others are just over 80, and 2 of the others are under 80 in the 70s, like myself and another fellow.
And our mutual friend...
Al Schragus is still going strong with us.
He coordinates this with you.
He's one of the Super Bowl coordinators, and years ago, he and his brother-in-law, Howard Caskell, who's my good friend and partner in the horse business, owned Doral Country Club, and we used to go there and play golf. and then go on to Minnesota or wherever the game was.
Since you brought up Mr. Caskel, let's talk about the horses.
Howard and I owned a filly, and 3 years ago she was New York State Filly of the Year, and I had named her after my granddaughter Ava Catherine, and the horse's name is Ava K. She's still having babies, and we just sold one of her babies for a substantial amount of money to Mr. Zayat, who owns American Pharoah.
Now, you and I met through charity. You've been very involved, as we said, with the Constitution, the Constitution Museum.
I'm a life trustee of that museum.
And you're also the Maxwell Institute at Syracuse University.
I'm on the advisory board of Maxwell School. I have a meeting there October 22nd, and we're giving an award to Donna Shalala, who's also on our board.
And in addition to that, you have the World War II.
World War II Museum, where I'm a patron, and I've spent a lot of time. And our company so happens, right now, we're doing a huge new Veterans Administration hospital in New Orleans, not far from the museum.
NYU Medical Center. You've been involved with the with Lepore's program, the urological research.
I'm involved with Dr. Lepore and urological research at NYU. I'm involved with Dr. Mark Adelman, who's chief of vascular research, and Leon Pachter, who's the chief surgeon of the whole hospital, who is world-famous physician and saved my oldest son's life. Speaking
of sons, we have a picture of your oldest son, his name?
Bill.
Bill and his wife.
Elizabeth.
Elizabeth, and then John, who works with you.
John, who's works with us and has brought the company from when I used to figure jobs on napkins into technology, where today we're working on probably maybe 50 or 60 jobs right now, and I can go in my computer, pull up every job, see how many men are working, where they're working, how much money has been spent on materials and manpower.
And John
set all this up with another young engineer we have. John is married to Mary, and they have 3 little kids. Ava is 7, Nikki is 10, and Alexander's 13.
And last but not least, the woman who left Skidmore to finish at Syracuse. You've been married?
Who's the lady behind the throne, Susan, my wife Susan. We went to high school together, graduated from Mamaroneck High School together. I used to annoy her a little bit. We were friends, but she was a cheerleader. I was captain of the basketball team my senior year, and but she cheered for the other guys. We were good friends, but not going out with each other.
So, as component or score carpentry, recently celebrated its 50th anniversary.
Right.
As they say, another 50 years at least. Okay?
Exactly.
Continue to do the great work about the. Especially in a difficult industry of the construction business to be.
Construction industry is a tough industry in New York. It's always been very difficult based on the history if you look at the type of folks that have been involved. But today we have 7 offices around the country.
So thank you very much for being here.
Thank you, Michael, for having me.